7,500 liters. That's the estimated water footprint of a single pair of blue jeans. Yes, the one sitting in your closet right now. To put this into perspective, that's enough water to keep a human being hydrated for about 7 years. And here's the kicker: many people pay extra for jeans with the knees already ripped out. I know you've seen it. It reminds me of something Yvon Chouinard, Patagonia's founder, wrote in Let My People Go Surfing. The products should earn their wear through real use, not just faked in a factory. A life lesson, perhaps, but it does shorten the product's life. And for the sake of this conversation, it wastes the water that went into making it. Most of us never see that water. Now, maybe we will. Our new slogan perhaps should be hashtag Think Water. I am Reese Tisdall, and this is The Future of Water, in which we talk about all the ways in which companies, utilities, and people are addressing all those challenges and opportunities in water. This is episode 139, and I have a good feeling it's going to be a good one. That's because we're going to speak with Bluefield analyst Olivia Cranefuss about water for agriculture. Size of the market that makes up more than 70% of U.S. water withdrawals, but also key shifts in the market. This includes things like M&A, company strategies, market trends, and new technology adoption. We at Bluefield, we've been talking about this sector for some time. So now is the moment we go public, particularly since Olivia just released an in-depth report, Water for U.S. Agriculture, Irrigation Trends, Technology Adoption, and Market Forecasts. So this is going to be a good conversation to dig into some of those details. But before we get to Livy, you're going to have to bear with me just a little bit longer because something caught my eye this past week, and it probably caught yours too. One thing that caught my eye is the reaction in global energy markets following the conflict with Iran. And what does that mean really for the water sector? Because that's what I'm thinking about. Energy markets have moved pretty quickly. Brent crude has jumped from a pre-invasion average of about $73 a barrel in February to roughly, last I checked at the time of this, by $83 to $85 a barrel. That's a 14 to 16% increase. Okay, we can live with that perhaps. But the bigger story may be in Europe's natural gas market. Dutch TTF prices climbed from about 31 euros a megawatt hour to roughly 52 to 56 euros a megawatt hour. That's a 70 to 80% spike. The question is it just a spike? But also, what does this mean for water? Because energy is one of the largest controllable costs for water utilities. In many systems, energy accounts for anywhere from as low as 11% to as much as 40% of operating expenses. Kind of depends on, are you a drinking water treatment facility or are you wastewater? But the bottom line is electricity runs the entire water cycle, from pumping water through distribution networks to aeration and wastewater plants and energy intensive processes like desalination. Europe's utilities they're far more exposed to energy volatility, whether it be because of Russia, Ukraine, their energy transition from things like coal and nuclear towards gas and or renewables. The US is relatively insulated by domestic oil and gas production. So we don't really even see the pain that they're going through. But Europe operates in a far more volatile energy market. And wastewater treatment plants are among the most energy intensive municipal assets. Treatment counts for roughly 80% of energy use in a wastewater segment, and aeration alone can consume 50 to 70% of a plant's electricity. So it's all unfolding really quickly, and these energy shocks are hitting advanced treatment, things like desalination, the hardest. This means that regions relying on desalination or advanced treatment, places like Southern Europe, the Middle East, parts of Australia, they're all exposed when energy prices rise so suddenly. So when power prices spike, utilities do feel it quickly, and the costs will eventually flow into the tariffs. In fact, I was just reading a Bluefield Research report last night that shows that we're at a 5-year high of utility rate increases. So we're looking at a 5.1% increase for utility rates. And part of this is driven by energy. So these are some of the quick thoughts that I had when I was reading the news the other day and thinking about what I can talk about on this podcast and what caught my eye. And that's definitely one of them. One of the things that I've been thinking about and I've been speaking to the Bluefield research team about, particularly the team in Barcelona who's feeling the pain. So with that being said, let's get to Olivia Cranefuss and talk a little bit about water for agriculture. I think there's some interesting things to draw out of this conversation. All right, so I'm joined by Olivia Cranefuss. Olivia, what's going on?
Hey Reese, not much. How you doing?
Pretty good, pretty good. It's Friday, um, crappy weather, as we talk a lot about at the beginning of all these podcasts. And but you're going out of town next week.
I am, and I might also have some bum weather where I'm going to. I'm going to be in London, so it'll probably be more gray and rainy over there.
All right. Well, it's going to be nice here. I think it's going to be in the 60s or 70s, unfortunately. So once we
Yeah,
get
I think I'll miss
past,
that.
yeah, once we get past this sleet storm. All right. So super excited to have you on because, as I mentioned in the intro, we've been talking a lot about water for agriculture, what it means, what the opportunity is for a long time at Bluefield. We've done, I think, an exceptional job on the municipal sector, analyzing that. We've looked at the industrial sector and all the different verticals. But then there's this huge piece of the pie that we haven't really addressed in great detail, and that is agriculture. And you've just released a report that goes into great detail on basically water management for the ag sector in the US. And so your report points to, I think, if I recall, $84 billion transition, I think is the phrase we use. So as we're looking at $84 billion market of spending for irrigation over the next several years. So let's just talk big picture a little bit. What's driving the shift and what do we see in a relatively mature and well-established market?
Yeah, that's a great question, Reese. As you mentioned, irrigation is a pretty mature market. It's projected to average about $13.5 billion annually through 2031. But growth as a whole is relatively modest at just about 2 to 3% annually. And that really reflects the maturity of irrigation infrastructure. On top of that, the number of irrigated acres in the US has roughly stayed the same over the last 20 years, only rising by about 4%. And that acreage actually declined slightly in the last 5 years. So, market growth is really less about expansion and more about system modernization. That's really largely to do with how water and energy intensive irrigation is. So, agriculture right now accounts for about 70% of groundwater withdrawals in the US. It's the largest source of groundwater use across the nation. It's one of the most water intensive industries globally. And as regions across the US now struggle with land subsistence, as rivers dry up, as droughts become more prevalent and persistent, farmers are increasingly having to rethink how they irrigate. And on top of that, the cost of energy is a huge portion of expenses. It's the largest single category of irrigation spending, making up about 28%. So, those two things combined are shifting the market towards smarter irrigation technologies and tools that reduce both the water and energy needed. This includes the increased use of drip, micro, low flow irrigation systems, and marks a transition away from traditional gravity based systems and a bit away from sprinkler systems as well. This also includes a shift towards the use of digital tools and technologies to monitor water and energy use. And this is a big one, and digital equipment is a big component of the outlook of the market. And I'm sure we'll dive further into that landscape in a bit.
So I can tell that for all the listeners out there, I don't know if you can hear in the background, but this is the morning entrance of Pat Byrne into our office. I can hear him talking in the background. So apologies for that, and a shout out to Pat Byrne, our biosolids expert. But all right, so That's a lot. There's a lot going on. I mean, you threw out numbers like 70% of groundwater usage in the US, and I think it's probably the same or more in the rest of the world. But also irrigation spending, we're looking at 13.5 billion through 2031, I think is what you're saying. So these are still pretty substantial numbers, and we're looking at modest growth. But you did say one thing, and that is that energy accounts for a big chunk. I think in the report we talk about 28% of irrigation spending goes towards energy, and then labor represents a big chunk as well, maybe more so. So when you look at the rest of the cost structure from equipment, pumps to water acquisition and digital technologies, where are farmers and irrigation providers really allocating their capital?
Right. Operating expenses really are dominating irrigation spending. OPEX accounts for over 80% of total costs. Like you mentioned, that's really largely driven by energy and labor. Beyond those costs, spending is spread across equipment and machinery, water purchases, and larger infrastructure pieces like wells and storage systems. There's also a whole network of water delivery organizations that supplement water where farmers don't have enough sources on their own property. This network is primarily made up of public, quasi municipal entities called irrigation districts, but also a myriad of smaller private canal and ditch companies. And perhaps not surprisingly, the largest portion of spend for those organizations is in storage and distribution because their job is mainly consist of conveying large amounts of water to farmers in their jurisdictions. But what's really interesting is that the fastest growing segment is digital irrigation technologies. So this includes sensors, automation, control panels, irrigation scheduling platforms, all these aimed at reducing both energy use, labor intensity, and water use of the systems.
Yeah, because I think that's the disruption, right? In some ways, right? Where is the change really happening? I think if you haven't said it, I'll say it now. Maybe we can get into this, but it's highly fragmented. The irrigated land, I think that's really important. It hasn't changed much, right? As we look historically, that's not really where the change is. So just by the advent or the release of new technologies and solutions, and that can be sensors, that can be satellites and their applications, you're seeing a lot of activity in that space. So and that's really where we started to focus. But one thing that was really interesting, or is interesting, in the report is how you bifurcate the analysis and how you sort of break out. So it's highly fragmented, even though there's a small percentage of large farms. I think that's where everybody seems to focus, but it's still there are a lot of small farms out there. How do we break out or how do we segment the agriculture market? I think you alluded to this. We have irrigation districts, then you have on farm. Is That's kind of how we've looked at it, right? How do you define that?
That's right. So, on farm water sources are really any sources that farmers get water from their own properties. That might include storage tanks, rivers that run through their properties, ponds, um, canals that they build themselves. And then off farm water, like I mentioned before, goes back to these irrigation districts and other private companies that deliver off farm water. And you alluded to this a little bit, but it's a pretty fragmented market on both those fronts. So, despite the trend of consolidation of farmland that we've seen over the last 10 years, family farms still represent more than 90% of all farms in the US. This means that most purchasing decisions across farms are highly distributed and decided on a pretty small scale. Despite this volume, though, a lot of these family farms are still incredibly small. So, it's actually a pretty small portion of these large farms, about 3%, that control roughly a third of irrigated acreage. These larger farms have more concentrated capital spending abilities and typically have faster adoption of new, expensive technologies. This same trend also exists on the off farm side, where a very small portion of large irrigation districts control a pretty large portion of water delivery, but there's a ton more smaller water delivery organizations that also have a lot of that market share. So, overall, the market on both the on farm and off farm water side are highly fragmented, and this duality kind of limits vendor scale advantages and generally slows adoption cycles.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, for listeners, and we've talked a lot about Muni on this podcast. And so I think I look at the muni sectors somewhat analogous to agriculture. One, both really well established. Two, in the muni sector, you basically have 400, 415, what we would call large municipal systems in the US. And then you have another 49,600 systems that are incredibly fragmented. They're all over the place and they require different business models or and approaches. And I think agriculture is similar to that, right? When you're looking at this 3% of farms controlled, you're really targeting those companies. They're spending real dollars and real money. The question is, what do you do with those smaller fragmented farms? And that's where things like or channels to market, should I say, like distributors versus, do you go, direct? And what makes the most sense for companies approaching this market, whether it be pipe suppliers, pump vendors, et cetera. So, all right, well, now that I've said it, let's change gears a little bit and look at some strategic divides. So, on one hand, we're seeing companies like AliAxis, they're investing in data platforms like CropX. I think one or both are at least mentioned and profiled in the report you've done. They're building out, vertically integrated pipe to platform solutions, I think. On the other hand, you see companies like Orbia, which formerly Mexichem at this point, they're divesting irrigation assets or solutions like Netafim. And Netafim, I think that when it comes to smart irrigation, they are one of the biggest players in the world. Is this a signal that the market is shifting from hardware to software driven value creation, or is it something else? What underlies these changes?
Yeah, it's certainly an example of how important digital systems are becoming in the market. So, hardware still remains the backbone of irrigation from the pipes, tubes, valves, meters, and sprinkler heads. But digital platforms are becoming the control layer for water, energy, and labor optimization and are certainly where the market is headed. The adoption of digital equipment is really increasing, and most of the major players in this market are seeing that and adjusting their portfolios to integrate digital offerings in some capacity. And as I mentioned, digital equipment is the fastest growing segment for the market right now. And a lot of these digital technologies are also enabling recurring revenue models through subscriptions and services. This shift, I think, really reflects broader agricultural trends towards precision agriculture and data driven farm management. We see this not just in irrigation, but really across the entire agricultural sector, from GPS guided tractors to precision planting equipment to AI powered laser weeders. Farming is becoming more digital, and irrigation is certainly part of that trend.
Yeah, I think part of it is it's just happening whether we want it to, or they're just driving efficiencies. These solutions are out there. The question is, how fast is the uptake of these solutions, right? Whether it's in a small segment of the ag sector or whether it is just slow growth and rolling out little by little. That's why I find it interesting. And so when we talk about these digital technologies, it is the fastest growing segment. When we ran the model, the forecast model and the stack, so we're looking at $13.5 billion. The digital slice of that stack is growing faster. So what's driving the growth? What other than, as I just said, there's just technology out there and people are using it and leveraging it. What are the underlying drivers?
Right. Well, first to start off with, digital irrigation equipment is, a relatively newer part of the farming transition, and so it's still a fairly small part of the equipment market. While the general equipment and machinery market represents just under $2 billion dollars in 2026, digital hardware and software only accounts for about 200 million. But that being said, as I've hinted at throughout the podcast so far, it's by far the fastest growing segment for the market right now. Digital technologies are projected to grow at around 13% annually. This is far faster than the broader market and also twice as fast as the second fastest growing segment. So, this really is driven by the adoption of technology like soil sensors, automation, telemetry, and scheduling platforms that are solutions for labor shortages, water scarcity, compliance with groundwater regulations, energy cost, all things I've mentioned before. In fact, out of all the methods that farmers are using to decide when to irrigate, soil and plant moisture sensors have risen by 36% in the past 10 years. And by comparison, all other traditional methods of deciding when to irrigate have all declined. So it's really clear that digital equipment is really where the spend and the market is going towards. And what I think is particularly interesting about that is this digital shift is also changing the competitive landscape. So historically, the irrigation market has really been consolidated among some key manufacturers. That includes global companies like Valmont, Lindsay, Rank, Hunter for sprinkler irrigation, and other names like Netafim, Rivalis, Jane, Toro, Irritech for drip irrigation. But as we're seeing this new market emerge for digital solutions, essentially all these major players are adjusting their portfolios to include digital integration or products in some way. And this shift has also opened up a new, more fragmented market for digital service providers. So we're seeing now a wide range of companies entering the technology space for soil sensors, satellite imaging, integrated cloud based scheduling platforms. And there are a ton of these small investor backed companies now popping up. It's a big shift, and it'll be interesting to watch kind of who rises to the top and what products they're providing.
Yeah, I think, and this has come out of the research and analysis, and that is when you start looking at some of these companies, like I mentioned, Aliaxis. I mean, they're a pipe company, right? That you've got Georg Fischer, you've got these other Westlake. These are pipe suppliers providing, you know, methods or means for water transfers from one place to another. But then they're adding on layers, and some of it may be through their corporate venture fund investments, but also they are rolling up other companies. Orbia being a good example. They acquired Netafim, and I think their divestment is less to do about agriculture than the fact that they're extremely debt laden and have other challenges they need to address. And so this is a good opportunity. But that being said, I think, when I was sort of thinking through questions for this podcast episode, it's not all rosy, right? I mean, the ag sector is tough, much like the municipal sector. There are structural barriers to extremely fast growth that we see in things like data centers, right? Everybody's hot to trot on data centers. You see a lot less conversation about agriculture. So let's just be realistic here. What are some of the biggest inhibitors that companies face, at least those who are trying to enter the water for agriculture market, that they might want to know or understand?
Yeah, that's a great point. Agriculture in general is a fairly volatile market. Equipment purchases and as well for irrigation heavily depends on the economic strength of the agricultural sector. And this is really tied to farm income, commodity price cycles, shifting global climate patterns, global trade patterns. Government subsidies are also an important part of that and have represented roughly 13 to 14% of farm income over the past 15 years. These payments tend to spike when tariffs and trade disruptions or global weather events impact farm income, or when there are also other outstanding events like the COVID-19 pandemic. And even year to year, I think this market is very seasonal, and vendors face cyclical demand patterns, especially around planting cycles. The high upfront capital costs for irrigation systems can also slow adoption. And on top of that, some of these irrigation systems, particularly very large sprinkler systems, have 10 to 20-year lifespans, meaning replacement cycles are slow. I think another thing that's impacting growth is that water rights regulations and groundwater restrictions vary widely by state and region. States like California and Arizona are increasingly monitoring groundwater pumping, which is quickly shifting how farmers have to irrigate there. But states like Texas don't have as strict of monitoring and compliance there. So the landscapes are a little bit different from region to region. And I think that could be one reason also why a lot of irrigation vendors, including Netafim, have up and down sales year to year, just because they're contending with so many barriers outside of their control.
Yeah, I think it's tough, right? I think they're getting squeezed by things that farmers can't control, right? They can't control trade relations. They certainly can influence them, particularly if they're getting 13 to 14% of income from government payments. But the other is climate, right? And that's in many respects the big ticket item, which everybody thinks about when you think about smart irrigation, but it cuts both ways. It could be drought. It could be just be the Colorado River, right? We've got 7 states who can't agree on what the water allocation should be and who's going to take cuts going forward. And if anybody's in charge of that, I don't right now. There's not. But then the other side of that coin is it floods, right? There are times where we have these massive floods in the Midwest that wipe out crops for an entire season. And to your point, when you're looking at farm income, that has a lot to do with it. And so farmers, you know, they're not flush with capital to just throw out there. So it's a tough market, but I think on the margins, there are opportunities. Like you said, digital is something that it's not, it addresses um, existing costs, right? It lists, whether it be labor costs, whether it be energy costs. And so if there's a relatively quick or decent ROI on that, then it makes sense. But in a highly fragmented market, it's hard to do it all at once. It's just going to be a slow rollout. All right. Well, so let's look forward a little bit. In brief, where do you see the biggest opportunities for companies across the water sector? Is it equipment suppliers, technology companies, infrastructure providers? What gets you and maybe the industry excited?
Right. Well, as I've been talking about, digital equipment projected to grow the fastest. That's really where I think a lot of the opportunity will exist as farmers really start to adopt more digital technologies for their farms, particularly vendor agnostic solutions that can integrate with various types of existing irrigation equipment and controls. I think that will be really important to look for going forward as well. But I mentioned this at the top, there's been also a shift towards drip and micro low flow irrigation systems, especially in water stressed regions. Over the last 10 years, the use of these drip and low flow systems has increased by 32%, while sprinkler system use has decreased by 12%. So that's a pretty big disparity. And we're definitely seeing, while the amount of drip irrigation is still a lot smaller, it's definitely growing. And we'll see that trend continue. I think we're also going to see growing investment in digital monitoring tied to groundwater management regulations. As groundwater pumping becomes more heavily regulated in states like California, some of the Colorado River Basin states, digital platforms, meters, valves that help with compliance will also become an important part of the market there. Another big part of the water use shift will be on the water delivery side. So, irrigation districts are increasingly modernizing their conveyance systems. A major part of this will be lining distribution canals, installing buried pipelines to deliver water, which drastically reduces the amount of water lost to seepage and evaporation. This also includes installing automated gates, flow meters, SCADA systems. All these things control water delivery and generally reduce water loss across the distribution systems. These off-farm infrastructure upgrades are funded primarily through a mix of user fees and also grants from the Bureau of Reclamation, particularly the Water Smart program, which has awarded just over $73 million to irrigation and water districts for these types of projects. So there's a lot of funding going into infrastructure upgrades, and I think there'll be a big opportunity for pipe companies there as well.
No, I like it. I think that's a good baseline for what we're thinking. So I like that a lot. I got a quick question for you, and then I'm going to let you go. And that is, we haven't really talked about policy, and this is something that you think about. Why would a farmer? I mean, is it purely cost? Is there any indication that state governments or the federal government, for that matter, or Colorado River, that they would, I don't know if mandate maybe a better way to do it, incentivize, similar to what's happened in renewables, right? You put out incentives, incentive tax structures, so tax credits or other drivers for smart irrigation. Is there anything out there that exists that you've come across in the research that would compel a farmer, a farm owner to deploy smarter irrigation solutions?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned the Water Smart program, which funds a lot of infrastructure upgrades for water delivery organizations, but they also fund a lot of projects for on farm irrigation upgrades and modernization as well. A lot of that money goes to drip irrigation and digital technologies. There are also some water storage and conveyance, water recycling, and desalination projects that are funded by the Bureau of Reclamation that also are going towards on farm projects as well. I think the other policy piece that's a little interesting in regards to some of the groundwater management is that there's been a lot of pushback from farming communities as to how much states can actually monitor their groundwater usage. And I think, for example, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, SIGMA in California, that's kind of the largest one in this area, hasn't been as successful at monitoring groundwater pumping as I think they'd like to be because, like I mentioned, there's been a lot of legal pushback. And so we're sort of seeing that policy in terms of restricting water isn't as successful, but there are a lot of state and government and national level grants that are really trying to help farmers adopt more water efficient technologies. So there's definitely some funding coming from the government as well.
Yeah, and I'm winging it here, but so I'm just trying to think. I think to incentivize in today's day and age, meaning 2026, in today's day and age, incentivizing um, solutions or technologies to mitigate climate risk is not happening, right? I think that's kind of gone by the wayside for at least the time being. So I'm then pivoting towards, okay, well, what areas or how can policy help create jobs, whether it be farm jobs or infrastructure build out for irrigation districts? I say that about things like reuse, right? How do we get better at reusing, reclaiming water? Well, if companies and or farmers for that matter can be incentivized to invest in it, they're getting tax credits. The benefit is if they're making money, they get tax credits. And it's seemingly win-win. You get jobs, infrastructure build out. And I feel like that's where we're missing the point in some cases, right? Instead of just throwing dollars at, hey, deploy these new digital smart solutions to they're not to say they're not helpful. I'm just trying to get a groundswell of public support because it benefits everybody. And I'm not saying there's no answer to that right now. That's kind of what I was looking for, hopefully. And I think there is some of that in your response, but that's helpful. All right. Well, anything else to add before I set you free into the weekend and on a trip to London for the week?
I just wanted to add, I think the agricultural and irrigation space is a really interesting one. This is where my background is in from school and from past jobs, and so I'm really excited to be looking more at the space, to be following the digital transition and really seeing how companies transform their portfolios, who's going to rise to the top, who's going to stick. And yeah, to your point before, how government incentives and policies are going to be impacting this going forward as well. And so I'm just excited to be diving more into this space.
Yeah, government policy in the ag sector. It's like the convergence of two sloths moving at breakneck speed to implement change.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, Olivia, thanks a million for jumping on. This is super helpful, super interesting. And for all the listeners, I'll lay out some details on the reports you just put out. It's really great. A lot of super great detail on forecasts, the trends, but also company strategies and company analysis, who's doing what. And I think there's a lot more to unpack on that. And I'm certain that any listeners out there, if you're thinking about agriculture with it, whether it be within your company or even yourself about where's the market heading, you can always reach out to Olivia. You can always just go to waterexperts at bluefieldresearch.com and ask questions. We're happy to talk about it because we do want to dig deeper into this area in a lot of different directions, not only in the US, but also globally. All right, Olivia, you're free to go. Enjoy the week. And sorry for the weather. Just take a raincoat and an umbrella and have fun.
Absolutely. It's on my packing list.
All
Thanks,
right.
Reese.
Take care. All right, there you go. That's a wrap for Water for Agriculture. Like I said from the outset, Livia has just released a report, Water for U.S. Agriculture, Irrigation Trends, Technology Adoption, and Market Forecasts. Super interesting. If you do have questions, reach out to us. I already gave you the email. And we are at bluefieldresearch.com. You can learn all about it there and then some, as well as this podcast. Before we sign off, here's a shout out to all those people that make it happen: Mike Gaylor, Ryan Sullivan, Kelly Talbot, Steph Aldock, in this case, Olivia Cranefuss, and all the other guests that we've had, because that's where it happens. They're the ones releasing content, they're the ones with the insights. I'm just here to do my best to quarterback a conversation. If you're in Boston, Barcelona, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, or Paris, that's where we are. Reach out to us and connect in person. Also, quick interlude here. I'm going to be at UMC in Charlotte in a couple weeks. If you want to meet up then, you can always set that up. I'm actually speaking at a pre-conference forum on Monday, and then I'll be there for the better part of the week in the Queen City, Charlotte, North Carolina. If you have any ideas or topics you want us to tackle on this podcast and any other podcast going forward, water experts at Bluefield Research is where you can reach out to us. Also, just a shout out to Dave McGimsey, the Water Values podcast host. We work closely with him on that and help him with that podcast. But if you're looking to be a guest or, provide some insights, he brings on outside guests at Bluefield. Thus far, we are primarily focused on our internal content and capabilities and team. So if you listen to both, you'll kind of notice the difference between the two. This podcast and these water industry insights have been brought to you by the one and only Bluefield Research. To learn more about us and what we do, bluefieldresearch.com. Until next time, be well, be safe, and take care.